Clara Hadley had always been the kind of woman who noticed things, not in a suspicious way, simply in the way that some people are wired. She noticed the small details of the world around her, the way light changed through the kitchen window at different hours, the way her garden grew differently on the east side than the west, the way her husband Tom had started coming home late on Tuesday evenings, about 4 months ago, and always had a perfectly reasonable explanation ready before she had said a single word. She noticed that too. She noticed it, and she set it aside the way you set aside something you are not ready to look at directly. She put it in a quiet corner of herself, and went on making supper and tending her garden, and being the wife of Tom Hadley, who owned the dry goods store on Main Street in Harlow, Texas, and was considered by everyone in town to be a fine and upstanding man. Clara had grown up in Harlow. She had known Tom since she was 16. They had married when she was 19, and she had loved him in the uncomplicated way you love the first person who makes you feel chosen.
They had a small house on Elm Street with a porch and a garden, and a life that looked from the outside exactly like what it was supposed to look like. She had been happy. She was almost sure of that. Or she had been something close enough to happy that she hadn't examined the difference. The sheriff of Harlow had arrived 8 months ago. His name was Will Garrett, and he had come from a town further west where there had been trouble of some kind that people in Harlow mentioned in vague terms without ever quite specifying. He was 31 years old and tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that was serious by default and a manner that was direct without being harsh. He wore his badge the way some men wore their hats, like something that was simply part of him rather than something he had put on. Clara had met him formally at the church social 2 weeks after he arrived. They had exchanged perhaps 6 sentences, and she had come away with the impression of a man who listened more than he spoke and meant everything he said. She had not thought much about him after that. She had her own life to attend to. She found out on a Wednesday morning in October. She had gone to visit her friend Ruth at the house on the edge of town where Ruth lived alone since her own husband had passed 2 years before. Clara had been visiting Ruth every Wednesday morning for 6 years, bringing preserves or fresh bread, or simply herself and a few hours of company. She had not expected Tom's horse to be tied outside Ruth's house at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday, when Tom was supposed to be opening the store. She stood on the road for a long moment looking at that horse. Then she turned around and walked home. She walked slowly. The morning was cool and bright, and the elm trees along the street were turning gold in the October light, and everything looked exactly as it always had. The same houses, the same yards, the same town she had lived in her entire life. It looked completely different. She went home and sat at her kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a very long time. All those Tuesday evenings, all those perfectly reasonable explanations, the small distances that had grown between them over the past year that she had told herself were simply the natural settling of a long marriage. The way he sometimes looked at her now, with something behind his eyes that she had tried not to identify. She had known. She had known and had not let herself know. And Ruth, who had sat across from her every Wednesday for 6 years and drunk her tea and listened to her talk about her marriage and her garden and her life with the expression of someone who cared. That part was almost worse than Tom. She did not confront him that evening. She made supper and set the table and sat across from her husband and watched him talk about his day and marveled at how easy it was for him. How completely natural. How many times he had sat in this chair in this kitchen and looked at her across this table, knowing what he knew. She ate and listened and said the appropriate things. And when supper was done, she washed the dishes and went to bed and lay in the dark beside him and stared at the ceiling. She was not angry yet. The anger would come later. What she felt now was something colder and more final, like a door closing, like the last page of a book turning, like understanding finally and completely that the life she had believed she was living had been something different all along.
She started sleeping in the spare room the following week. She told Tom she had been sleeping poorly and didn't want to disturb him. He accepted this with a relief that told her everything about the state of his conscience. She went about her days. She tended her garden. She went to the store for supplies. She attended church on Sunday. She smiled at the people she had always smiled at and answered their questions about how she was getting on and said she was fine. She was not fine. But she was something. She was standing. She was getting up every morning and putting one foot in front of the other, and that had to count for something. It was the sheriff who noticed she was not fine. She had not expected that. She was in the general store on a Thursday afternoon in November, buying flour and sugar, when he came in for something and found her standing in the middle of the aisle with a bag of flour in her hands, staring at absolutely nothing. She didn't notice him until he was beside her. He didn't ask if she was all right, probably because it was obvious she wasn't, and asking would have required her to lie. Instead, he simply took the flour from her hands because she had been holding it for some time, and set it on the counter and asked Mrs. Pierce to put it on the Hadley account. Then he held the door for her, and they walked out into the gray November afternoon together. They walked half a block without speaking. Then he said that if she ever wanted company on her porch, he took his coffee at 5 in the morning before the town was awake, and the offer was there if she needed it. Then he tipped his hat and went back toward the sheriff's office. She stood on the boardwalk and watched him go, and felt something shift very slightly in her chest. Not dramatically, not like something beginning, just like a small amount of pressure releasing that she hadn't realized she had been carrying. She was on her porch at 5 the following Monday morning. She hadn't planned it. She had simply been awake at 4:30 the way she had been awake at 4:30 every morning for weeks, and at 5 o'clock she had found herself on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the dark street. He came around the corner at 5 past 5 with 2 cups and stopped when she saw her already there. Something moved across his face briefly. Not surprise, exactly. More like quiet satisfaction. He came up to the porch and handed her one of the cups and sat in the other chair, and they watched the town come slowly out of the dark together. They didn't talk much that first morning. A few words about the weather, about the frost that had come early this year, about the way the elm trees looked in the pre-dawn dark. But the silence was comfortable in a way that surprised her. She had been so accustomed to silences that needed to be filled or managed or explained. This one simply was. She went inside when the town started to wake up, and Tom's sounds began from upstairs. She felt better than she had in weeks. Not happy, just less alone. She was back on the porch the following Monday, and the Monday after that. November became December, and the mornings got colder, and she started bringing a blanket out to the porch, and he started arriving a few minutes earlier. She learned him in those early morning hours the way you learn someone when conversation is unhurried and there is no performance required. He had grown up in East Texas, the son of a blacksmith. He had become a deputy at 22 because the sheriff in his town had needed someone and he had been available, and had discovered that the work suited something in him: the need to make things right, the inability to look away from injustice. He had been a sheriff for 6 years across 2 counties. He was good at it, not because he was hard, but because he was steady, because people could see that he meant what he said and would do what he promised. She asked about the trouble that had brought him to Harlow eventually, not directly. She wasn't sure she had the right to be direct with him yet. He answered directly anyway. There had been a man in his previous town who had been hurting his family, and the law had not been able to touch him, and Will had stepped outside the law to touch him, and had resigned his position afterward because it was the right thing to do, even though he didn't regret the other thing. He had moved on, and Harlow had needed a sheriff, and here he was. He told her this simply and without apology. She thought about a man who would step outside the rules to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves, and then hold himself accountable for it afterward. She thought about Tom and his Tuesday evenings and his smooth, easy explanations. The comparison was not flattering to her husband. She confronted Tom the week before Christmas. She had waited until she was steady enough to do it without falling apart, until the cold clarity she had been living with since October had become solid enough to stand on. She told him she knew. She said it simply and without accusation, just the fact of it. She knew about Ruth, and she knew it had been going on for months, and probably longer, and she was done pretending otherwise. Tom went through several expressions in quick succession: denial, calculation, then something that might have been relief. He had been carrying it too, and he was tired of the weight. He didn't insult her by lying when she had said it plainly. He confirmed it. He said it had started before she thought, over a year ago. He said he was sorry. He said it in a way that suggested he meant it, but also in a way that suggested sorry was the end of what he had to offer. Clara sat across from her husband in their kitchen and felt the last of what she had been holding on to let go. Not with drama, just quietly.
The way a hand opens when it finally stops gripping. She told him she wanted him out of the house by the new year. He nodded. He had somewhere to go. Of course he did. She went to bed and slept better than she had in months. January came in hard and cold. Tom moved his things out on a Saturday morning, and Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the sounds of it and felt something she hadn't expected. Not grief, not primarily. Mostly she felt the particular lightness of a weight that has finally been set down. The house was hers. She had grown up watching her mother keep a house, and she knew how to do it, and she was going to do it differently now, on her own terms, in her own time. The town talked. Of course it did. Harlow was not a large place, and the departure of Tom Hadley from the house on Elm Street did not go unnoticed or uncommented upon. Clara bore the attention the way she bore most things, quietly and with her back straight. Ruth she did not see. She did not trust herself to see Ruth dat. Perhaps she would one day, perhaps she wouldn't. That was a door she was leaving closed for now. The Monday morning porch visits continued.
They were different now that Tom was gone. Not because anything had been said, simply because the situation had changed, and they both understood that without needing to discuss it. The conversations went a little deeper, lasted a little longer. The silences held a little more. She found herself looking forward to Monday mornings in a way that she hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. He was the same as he had always been, steady and direct and completely without pretension. He didn't treat her differently because of what had happened with Tom, didn't offer sympathy in the way that felt like pity, didn't avoid the subject in the way that felt like cowardice. He simply was who he was and let her be who she was, and that was more than enough. In February, he asked if she would like to take a ride on Sunday afternoon. Just a ride, out to the river and back, nothing more than that. She said yes before she had finished thinking about it. They rode out to the river on a Sunday in February, with the land still frost-hardened and the sky a pale winter blue, and the bare trees along the bank making dark patterns against it. They rode side by side without hurrying.
The land looked different to her now than it had a year ago. Everything looked different. She had expected that to feel like loss, and instead it felt mostly like clarity, like she was seeing things as they actually were for the first time in a long time. He pointed out things as they rode, a hawk circling over the east field, the way the frost had formed crystals on the dry grass that caught the winter sun, a place on the river where the ice had formed in an unusual pattern around a fallen branch. He saw the world the way she saw it, in specific details, in the small, true things. They stopped at the river and let the horses drink, and stood side by side on the bank in the winter quiet. She thought about everything she had lost in the past 4 months, and everything she had found, and the weight of both things. He stood beside her in the cold and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and that was the thing about him. He always knew the difference. On the way home, she felt something she recognized after a moment as happiness, small and careful and new, like the first green thing coming up through frost-hardened ground. She decided to let it be there.
Spring came slowly to Harlow that year. The garden along the south side of the house was Clara's entirely now. She dug it up and replanted it the way she had always wanted it, rather than the way it had always been.
moved the rose bushes, added vegetable beds along the east fence, let the wild herbs grow in the corner her husband had always wanted cleared. Small things, but they were hers. Will came by on Saturday mornings sometimes to help with the heavier work, not because she asked, simply because he noticed what needed doing and did it with the same matter-of-fact competence he brought to everything else. She watched him work in her garden on a morning in April and thought about all the things she had believed love was supposed to look like. Grand gestures, declarations, the performed certainty of a man who has decided he wants something. What she felt watching Will Garrett stake her rose bushes in the April morning was nothing like any of that. It was quieter, more like recognition, like something settling into its right place after a long time of being slightly wrong. He looked up and found her watching him. He held her gaze with those steady, dark eyes.
She walked across the garden and stood before him, and the April light was warm on both their faces, and the roses were just beginning to bud, and the town was going about its Saturday business on the other side of the fence. She told him simply that she thought she was falling in love with him, and that she wanted him to know that. He looked at her for a moment with that particular stillness of his. Then he reached out and took her hand in his. He said he had been in love with her since November, and had been waiting until she was ready, and that he could wait as long as she needed, but he was glad she had told him. She laughed, actually laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere real, and surprised her with how good it felt. He smiled down at her, and it was the warmest thing she had seen in longer than she could remember. They did not rush. The town had opinions. It always had opinions. Some people thought it was too soon. Some thought Will Garrett was taking advantage of a woman in a difficult situation. A few thought it was the best thing that could have happened to Clara Hadley, who everyone agreed deserved better than she had gotten. Clara listened to none of it.
She had spent enough of her life arranging herself around other people's expectations. She was done with that particular habit. Through the spring and summer, they rode together on Sunday afternoons and sat on her porch on Monday mornings and went to church and ate supper and walked through the town in the evening and let things develop at the pace they wanted to develop. She learned all of him in that time, the serious and the quiet humor that lived underneath it, the way he was with people who needed help, the way he was with people who didn't deserve it, the deep sense of fairness that ran through everything he did, like a seam of something solid. She trusted him. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She trusted him completely and without reservation, and she understood now what a rare thing that was. She had not trusted Tom in years, without knowing she didn't, had been building little walls around herself, piece by piece, for a long time, without realizing what she was protecting herself from. With Will, there were no walls. There was just the plain, honest truth of who he was, and who she was, and what they were to each other.
He asked her to marry him on a Sunday evening in October, a year almost exactly from the morning she had stood on the road outside Ruth's house and looked at her husband's horse and understood that her life was not what she had believed it to be. They were sitting on her porch in the October evening, and the elm trees were golden again, and the air smelled like wood smoke and dry leaves, and the town was settling into its quiet evening sounds around them. He didn't make a production of it. He simply said that he wanted to spend his life with her, and he thought she might want the same, and he was asking. She looked at him in the October light, this steady, serious man who had handed her a cup of coffee in the cold dark of a November morning, when she was barely holding herself together, and had asked for nothing, and given her everything she hadn't known she needed. She said yes. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat on the porch in the golden October evening, and listened to the town around them, and she felt something she wanted to name precisely. Not the love of being chosen by the first person who noticed you.
Not the love of habit and familiarity and the comfort of what you have always known. Something truer than both of those things. The love of seeing someone completely, their whole honest self, and choosing them anyway, and being chosen back. She had not believed she would have this. she was wrong. And being wrong had never felt so much like grace.